Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is Michelle Savage with XBRL US, and you are here for our webinar on the roadmap to building successful financial data standards. We're very happy to have with us today Scott Tice. Scott is CEO of NovaWorks, just to pronounce that correctly. And most importantly, Scott is also the chair of our domain steering committee, which was key in bringing these materials to us today. We're also going to have Campbell Pride. Campbell is our president and CEO at XBRL US. And just a few logistical points. If anyone has any problems, any kind of technical difficulties as we go through the program, please send us an email at support@xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back online. And if you do have questions, feel free to send those in to us by using the Q&A link on your screen. You should see that up there, the little icon there for questions, and then we'll take questions at various points during the program. So to get started, I'm going to first walk us through our agenda. We're going to first talk a little bit about objectives of the program, and then we'll go straight into a review of the content for the Taxonomy Development Handbook, which, as we said, is a roadmap for practical steps in building good quality taxonomies. We'll talk about the standard a little bit itself. We'll talk about the concept of the taxonomy as the single data model, talk about giving meaning to data and components of the taxonomy, structuring data, assessing the scope of the project that you're taking on, the data model, and then finally get into actually building the taxonomy. I also want to mention, and we'll cover this a bit more in detail at the end of the program, that we are going to be launching a webinar series, starting with the first one on September 16th. And the webinar series is going to take a deeper dive into each of the chapters in the Taxonomy Development Handbook, which will really help walk you through the process for building a good quality set of data standards for regulators. And we hope everybody will join us for those programs as well. Again, they will be free, and please let people know about them. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Campbell Pride. Campbell?
Thank you, Michelle. So XBRL is a mature, stable standard that is in widespread use today. It lays out a standard way of defining the structure of financial data. So the standard itself is based on a technical specification, which was first published in 2003. And since that time, there's been a broad global community has grown to support both regulators, and government, and companies interested in adopting XBRL as a standard. And the standard continues to incorporate new innovations into the standard as technologies change and as we identify new use cases of how it can be used. Through XBRL International, there's a variety of technical working groups which anyone can get involved in that dedicate time to identifying new reporting needs and new technologies and expanding the XBRL specification where required. It's important to use standards that are stable and that are mature, and most importantly, widely adopted and used so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel and impose more costs on publishers of data. So a good standard becomes more valuable the more it's obviously used. The network effect accelerates adoption because of the benefits of interoperability. So think of standards like shipping containers or railroad track gauges. They didn't become standards until they'd been around long enough so that they could be widely used. And they had a solid community of users to support them and expand on them. So not using the standards becomes more costly than adopting the standard. So if you're going to have a railroad, if you have a different track gauge to everyone else, you get all the costs of trying to connect to the other railway lines. So the more the standard is used, the more it's adopted, the more the costs decrease because you get those benefits of network effects. So when it comes to reporting data consistently and cheaply and efficiently and quickly, you're better off using a working data standard. And if what needs to be reported as financial data, the most widely adopted standard at the moment is XBRL. So there is currently no machine readable standard that's currently available that is used across companies and governments around the world, so other than XBRL. Most financial data, however, is still transmitted in a non-standardized data model using standard formats such as XML, CSV, JSON, PDF, etc. But all of these use a data model that is specific to the individual reporter, even though the underlying data, even though it's using data format standards like XML or CSV or JSON. So it's really the equivalent of everyone having their own size shipping container, but using like a standard gauge of steel. So it's really important that when information is being exchanged, if we can exchange it in a standardized way, it can help to significantly reduce the cost. Everyone doesn't have to deal with it on a case-by-case basis. So what the work that Scott's has done on the Domain Steering Committee under his leadership, and he's going to present today the Taxonomy Development Handbook that's been created over the past 2 years. The intent of this is to really basically set out guidelines how these standards should be developed, how taxonomy should be developed, so that we can make sure that we have standards which help to reduce the cost of producing data. So the guide lays out the pros and cons of XBRL and how it can work for reported data. Until now, guidance and instructions on how to build good quality XBRL standards has been available, but it's been available in numerous documents. So this is really an effort to consolidate all this together. So now today, all of this is available in one place. Go to the next slide, please, Michelle. So this just gives you an idea of the slide, the global regulators who are currently using XBRL. So this isn't everyone. This is just a broad alphabetical list of the major regulators who have implemented XBRL. So it just kind of gives you an idea of the extent and the scope of how the standard's being used. Yeah, the next slide, please. In the US, in particular, banks have been reporting to the FDIC probably for the last 12 years approximately, and they've been reporting all this data in XBRL. This is the core report, which is a lot of very specific bank data, right down to the details of things like what swap products they have, etc. Public companies have been reporting to the Securities and Exchange Commission since 2008. And there's literally hundreds of thousands of filings that have been made in XBRL format. Mutual funds came online at the same time, and they've been reporting to the SEC. And recent initiatives include the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is rolling out an XBRL data collection system rather than collecting it in a software like Visual Fox Pro. And coming soon, the entities reporting to the SEC will be looking to report in XBRL include things like variable annuity and life insurance companies, business development companies, and closed-end funds. So in the US, there's quite a lot of work going on with XBRL at the moment, and globally there are still a lot of jurisdictions pushing to have more XBRL adopted just because of the cost reduction that it can achieve. So with that, I'll hand it over to Scott, who's going to walk through the Taxonomy Development Handbook. Thanks.
Thank you, Campbell. I'm going to go ahead and we'll swap screens here for a moment. So we started this a couple of years ago, and we did that with the primary goal, as you see here, to provide the basic reference and guidelines for XBRL taxonomy development, implementation, and maintenance, which actually covers a lot of information. It's a pretty wide scoping thing when you think about being able to turn around and build a project that may be based on a legacy system that you have to adapt and improve, or to move on to a new system. And in many cases, some of the things that we're showing as future items, like for the SEC, like the CEF stuff, is all brand new stuff. It's presently being reported as paper, or rephrase that, as being reported as HTML, but it's not very machine readable. And by putting it in a taxonomy, that's going to make a huge difference with respect to being able to consume and perform analysis on the data. The document that we created, we named the Taxonomy Development Handbook. The idea behind the handbook is it really gives you the basic information all in one place to do a lot of things that surround a particular subject. It's not meant to be a specification. It's meant to roll up other specifications. The actual document is available in two places. We have it at XBRL US at a particular location. Is XBRL US /XBRL reference /TDH/. It's also available on GitHub In addition, there's templates. I should have been watching my slides go by here to help out with white papers and XBRL overview and things like that. And I'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. And these are here to give folks that are building these things a launching point so they don't have to basically reinvent the wheel to do certain things. So here it is on GitHub. I can go ahead and show you that on the browser side. So there's XBRL US, and then over here we've got our GitHub access to it, where it's all in HTML. It's also available in PDF, and we did set it up so it will print nicely if you double-sided, if you decided to print it out and make it a print reference, if anybody does that anymore. So why do we want to have yet another XBRL document? There are plenty of things out there. We've got the original specification, dimensions, formula, OIM, some books that have been written, plenty of papers that have been published by many accounting firms. So there's a lot of data out there. And it's been my experience over the last decade or more that all of them kind of approach it from a different angle. I was very surprised many years ago. I'm not going to name the name of the accounting firm that I'd gotten this nice booklet PDF that had how to get going with XBRL. And the first thing it did is it started talking about XML syntax. Whoa, I don't think most people want to deal with XML syntax. We want to talk about data structure and how to do things. We do cover some of that information here only in the sense of to contrast the different methods of being able to send data off to a repository. So what the TDH does is it rolls all this up into a handbook and references those materials. It stands on top as a way to sum up and put this information in what we hope is an easy to read format with lots of charts and things to help people get started and to break it down into the process from terminology and everything else. And what I'm going to be doing here over the next 15 minutes is talking about some of what's in here and why we approach things a particular way. So let's kind of look at a common scenario that we face all over the world. I've got a whole bunch of business or entity data, whether it's a college or a corporation or a local government, whatever the case is, and it's stored in a lot of different systems. Those systems can range from anything from being a bunch of Excel sheets to software to somebody who set up a proprietary SQL database, all kinds of different options with that. And we all know too that these things evolve over time. They're expanded, they're adjusted, and from year to year, new things will be put on, other things will be retired. When we want to report things, we generally want to put that data or sections of that data into some sort of a semantic model, some sort of understandable thing for being able to report what is going to go to the regulator or what's going to go to an interested party. Some of the taxonomies that have been developed in the past couple of years don't actually go to regulators. They go to people who are interested in the data for other purposes, for application purposes, being able to grant surety and things like that. That eventually ends up being put into some sort of transport. It could be anything in terms of the format, but again, there's going to be some sort of a structure to that. And then eventually it ends up over at some specific consumer. It could be public, it could be non-public, it could be any number of different things. It's kind of interesting early on with XBRL, there was a lot of discussion about it being used within companies to move data around. I don't think that's really, maybe hasn't happened because it would be private, it's kind of hard to track. It seems to have found its best home in terms of being able to go between separate entities and report specific information. So if we look at the kind of desired situation where I've got this semantic model, I'm getting things into this transport model. I may in turn report that to a regulatory system of one sort or another. And that in turn may or may not, depending on what the conditions are, go out to various levels of consumer models. It could be anything from universities, educational institutions that might do analysis. They could be market people watching the market and doing analysis, could be any kind of thing, industry followers, etc. Ideally, it would be nice to have some sort of a standard structure that dictates the layout, the data model, and then what data is to be transported, and then how that data is to be read and treated, and under what rules each element of the data applies, not data rules, but rules in the sense of why is this being disclosed? And who does this piece of data belong to? Why did the filer, the preparer, actually take that data and present it? So when we build this transport model, it's got a bunch of requirements. I'm just pulling a few out here that are of interest. Excuse the pop-up. And there's many more, but what some of the top ones are that the data has to satisfy all the stakeholders. And this is actually a very important thing. And I've always kind of maintained this all the way back to when I was working on the SEC Edgar system. It's now decades ago, but it kind of dates me, where we have this kind of three-legged stool, or the man on the tightrope. And on one end, you've got the preparers, on the other end, you've got the consumers, in the middle, you've got the regulators. You have to have all those pieces working together in order to actually get this to work right and to be satisfactory for everybody. It needs to be reasonably easy to prepare. You can't have something that requires an onerous amount of effort to get the data in, or is subject or prone to error because there's so many steps and it's so hard to validate. It's got to be comprehensive enough to meet the regulatory requirements. Each agency or whatever government organization happens to be requiring somebody to file is doing that according to rules promulgated based on laws laid out by Congress. So it's got to be able to be comprehensive enough and adaptable enough to meet those requirements. It also needs to be complete enough to satisfy consumers, and I say in here as appropriate, because in some cases there aren't really consumers. This has been an issue with SEC filings. The markets want data, and they want that free flow of information that really kind of lubricates markets, and the data has to be good. It's got to be reliable and timely. So that's an important part of this. We understand too, from my perspective, that when you look at SEC filings, they're not covering everything that data consumers need. They're getting data from a lot of different sources, but a big chunk of it is coming from the actual registrants. It should have a clear implementation process. In other words, everybody that's involved with this should have a good understanding of what it's going to take to implement, how it's going to be implemented, the testing cycle, how is it going to be governed, essentially. And then finally, no matter what you build, it needs to be extensible. It has to be able to satisfy future requirements. A lot of us like to look ahead 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road to see exactly what is going to be happening, but we don't really know. So the system needs to be able to adaptable to upcoming situations. So let's kind of look at the problem. It's state of the art 2020, and I can't believe I'm actually saying this, given my work within electronic data for so long, that recently, I think it was last year, I was at the CFA Institute in November, and we had major investment banking outfits talking about taking data and copying and pasting it, or paying people to type it back in. And I'm like, wow, why are we doing that? We really should have moved beyond that at this point. So this is the hurdle. We take this data and we put it in multiple formats. Some of them are open, some of them are proprietary. Some are loaded whatever's available. You get people copying and pasting or even typing. We look at this, the easiest model. Well, I have existing forms. I take those forms and I put a form filler in for PDF. Or maybe I don't even do that. I just produce the output as PDF, print the PDF from Windows or whatever, and I get documents that satisfy kind of the paper model, and that gets collected up. And there's an implied data model to that. Anytime you put together any sort of data form, it's going to have a data model to it. You do not realize it, but it does. And then that will go to some users. Could be regulators, could be the public. Could be any number of people. Then you've got the other method where you've got report preparation tools that are going to some particular database and being sent out. I don't know if Campbell will want to talk about this later if we have time or not, but like in the FERC environment where they're coming in, they have an existing database that's been around for a while, and the software has become outdated. It's legacy. It's not supported anymore. So as a consequence, they need to have a new format, and are moving to XBRL. But so you have these, they're highly proprietary. you can end up stuck on platforms that maybe aren't supported anymore, or even worse, operating system versions that are no longer supported. So this isn't necessarily the greatest method, but that's something that is around for a lot of legacy systems. The better method is to have a data container and model that lets you come from multiple systems. That's well known. The structure of it's well known. The taxonomy is developed specifically for the particular application. You can pool this data together. You can use existing APIs and other tools to do analysis and pull data out. And that's where we feel XBRL is a good answer to that. So we kind of lay out what the problem is. We've got all these disparate methods of collecting data, and we have a lot of people consuming it, using it for a lot of different purposes all across the board. I mean, we are a data society, and yet we have to still deal with jumping over these chasms of horrible formats and bad data structure and things like that. So the solution, we think, again, is XBRL, but what does that mean? That means building a particular taxonomy that is going to make sense, that's going to answer the question. So what we do within the TDH, I'm just kind of break this down chapter by chapter. It kind of ends up being the easiest way to talk about this, is that we provide an infrastructure, a way to define a data model via a taxonomy. We'll talk about this term a couple of times. That we have an instance of the data, that's essentially the report, that can be represented using a number of different methods. One of the early things with XBRL is it was based on XML. And at that time, XML was the choice du jour of data formats. Everybody was in love with it at the beginning of the 2000s and et cetera. And it's still widely used today, but it's considered to be considerably more rigid and difficult to use than, say, some other formats that are in favor today. Well, we're not locked into that. With the XBRL does not mean XML. Today, it means you can use a number of different things, including the taxonomies and stuff. We're working on things now at XII and whatnot to eventually have everything transported off of XML. So we're not locked into that. Yet some of the data structuring things that come along with XML, we're carrying through. I mean, there's some really good things that happen with XML with respect to being able to define schemas and things. It provides XBRL easy documentation and linking to authoritative references. Through the use of documentation labels and various types of labels, you can provide a lot of information with the taxonomy, and if so desired, the reporting entity can also provide label information to refine data that's being submitted. The taxonomy concepts themselves can carry a wealth of information between the fact that they can be grouped together. And then, of course, we have a number of formats that we talked about. So that's what we're touching on Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is kind of the easy read as to why this works. It also talks about the documents that rely on, that the TDH relies on. Throughout our document, there are lots of links. When we talk about referencing something in the XBRL specification, you can click on it and go to the link. If there's something in formula, you can click on it and go to the link. If it's a style thing, you can go to the style reference. So there's lots of backlinking in it. In Chapter 2, we move on to kind of giving a high-level view of both data and how XBRL looks at data, how XBRL treats data. And the whole idea of getting things organized in particular structures, whether they happen to be a list or a table or a cube, or hierarchical, there's different ways of representing that information within XBRL. And one of the fundamental terms we have within XBRL is this idea of a data point is actually a fact. It becomes a fact when it is that particular thing is intersected by a number of dimensions. And we introduced these particular terms, and there's actually a thing called core dimensions. That is, you need to have these things. A perfect example would be a number. It needs to have a data type associated with it, and it needs to have a unit type. I mean, it might be in Canadian dollars or US dollars or euros, or perhaps it's in barrels or any number of different types of units. So these things intersect the information to generate a fact. A fact then is a unique point that is part of an instance that would be filed. For example, if I look at a table here and I pull a particular item out, from customer accounts receivable, we'll see that within XBRL, we have all kinds of things that are carried along with this. The concept is customer accounts receivable. It's a monetary type. It has documentation associated with it. It may reference, in this case, it could be a US GAAP codification item. It may also have different labels for different roles. For example, if it was used as a total or rolling something up, or if it was negated or a beginning or ending of a period. We talk about who the entity is, what period it's associated with, the time value is. And then again, mentioned before, units, and there are lots of different kinds of units. So the XBRL gives meaning to all this data. And if we kind of think again about those intersections, I take a bunch of data, I'm looking at a little expense information here. Those are my concepts. And then I might have my period dimension, which would be January 2020. So as that intersects across here, I have different values. So when we define a taxonomy, and we discussed this in chapter 2 again, we're talking about a really important term, and that is the concept. This has also been known as the element, and that came about because in XML, when you define a schema, you're defining XML elements. In essence, though, on a higher level, we want to talk about concepts. What does this particular group of data, what's its concept? And that then also crosses along into JSON and other formats more nicely, and it's not quite so tied into this XML idea. So the taxonomy defines concepts, and it defines the relationships between the concepts. And then each one of those concepts has certain intrinsic properties, like the data type or period type. Is it a duration? Is it something that you're going to go from so many months along, or is it a particular point in time, etc. So we discuss those types of things. And then we also talk about how the taxonomy has structures. There's kind of an entry point. There'd be a table, different axes associated with it in those concepts. You might have line items and calculations. There's lots of things that are defined within the taxonomy. If you look at that in a lot of viewers, particularly like Yeti, which is something that's commonly available for a number of different taxonomy viewers, you can go in and poke at the tree and find line items and find what the presentation table is supposed to look like. Find what the different dimensional items are. So then as we move on, we were talked before about the fact. So that fact, again, has that intersection of those core concepts, and the core concept and time, units, and then other things, or language, because I may have, for example, the fact represented in French and in English. That might be particularly true if you're north of where I am right now, or where most people are who are watching this. When you create an instance or build a report, you're going to collect all these facts together. And the basic part of an instance essentially includes the facts, the characteristics of each fact, and then what particular context, which is a group of items like the period or concepts and et cetera that it's connected to. And it can provide a lot of other information like calculation and labels and references. These would be in additional files. And the instance can be formatted in 4 different formats, actually. You have the traditional XML. That's what the SEC is transitioning out of right now. They started in 2009, where the report is essentially an XML instance along with 3, 4, 5 link-based files that describe things like presentations and whatnot. Or you can move to HTML with, is inline XBRL. And what that does, it says, hey, we're going to add the XBRL right in line with the HTML. We go into a table, we mark a particular number in a cell, and that gets a numeric type fact definition that's then hooked to a particular set of dimensions and periods and et cetera. And that HTML document will view just plainly in the browser, and you just won't see the additional information, or you can use viewing tools to be able to explore all the data or to extract it. Another method that's being used now is JSON, which is JavaScript object notation. That's kind of become an easy way to move things around because it's a hierarchical or table or list way. It's a very easy way to represent data objects. So what has happened with the open information model is XII has defined a method to be able to enumerate all the facts in a report, showing the fact values and then all the intersectional items for each of those. And then at that point, you essentially build all your different periods and things from that. You can supply additional information, or you can just simply supply the instance. And then finally, comma separated values, or CSV. I have to say that when I first looked at that, I was like, geez, aren't we kind of stepping backwards? Then Paul Warren had mentioned to me a while back, one of the main reasons for that is that when you're representing an enormous table, let's say it's got 100,000 rows in it, and that each one of those rows has, say, 60 or 70 columns of data in it, you still want to have those concepts associated with it. But what happens with the XML format or even JSON is the data becomes very codey. I'm going to end up with a concept being declared for every fact. I got to close it, got to carry all this stuff along with it. JSON's the same way. Well, with CSV, the way XBRL works that is that what we have is information that's on the headers of the files and the additional data, and it provides a structure to use the simplified format where essentially the only overhead when I come to a row is a comma between each field, or maybe comma in quotes, depending if the data needs to be quoted or not. So this has usage in very specific areas where it's much easier to represent large volumes of data as opposed to complex structures of data. So we talk about what the difference is, because it's going to get a little confusing if you first start off. What is the difference between a taxonomy and an instance? And get into what does the taxonomy contain? What does an instance contain? When you look at a taxonomy, this is something that is going to be developed by a working group of some sort that's going to create the data models that are going to be used to report particular data. It's going to be the people who are reporting that are going to create instances and or extensions to the taxonomy, should the taxonomy be open, and in addition, potentially calculations and other information that they may pass along with that. So once we've kind of figured out, hey, here's some of the terminology and things we have for defining data points, defining facts, and how those get moved around, we need to talk about how this stuff is all organized. So we go through some examples from end to end using your kind of traditional widgets to explain different ways of representing data and how that can be done in XBRL. The good news is XBRL is really flexible. The bad news is XBRL is really flexible. That means there's lots of ways that you can do it. And then if you don't consider all the avenues in terms of how you structure data, you may come up with avenues or roads that lead you down some place. It's like, oh, I wish I didn't do that 2 years ago because now I want to expand it and I can't. Or I've left an opportunity for data to be expressed in a number of different ways by the filer. And that's kind of one of the problems we've had with GAP for errors of comparability, because people can have different ways of representing more complicated data. So we talk about that at a fairly high level, but using actual real examples that can be followed along. And some of those examples are provided along as well, so you can play with them. 4, I understand what I'm doing with XBRL now. Now I got to figure out how I can actually build a project to do this taxonomy. We talk about some of the considerations, some of the things that go on, establishing use cases, identifying various stakeholders, setting the scope of the project, understanding who should be involved in that. We're not trying to tell people how to go through project management. I mean, obviously there are volumes and volumes of materials and videos and training courses and things like that to do project management. We're talking about the ingredients that we feel are important as part of that process of managing the building of a taxonomy that you need to apply to this development process. The next chapter deals with what we call the transport data model. That's no special term or anything, it's just a good way of talking about what is being submitted or moved around, being transported. and how to deal with the data architecture of that, how to determine what the model is, what the benefits are of each of these different mechanisms. And we also have some examples. It's not very codey. We don't go in there and say, here's where you put the angle brackets, but we do show you the differences so you can get a feel for how this stuff works and talk about that. An important part of any data is validation. You want to make sure when the data gets to the receiver on the other end, it is complete and as accurate as possible. Now, obviously, there's limitations to that, but certainly putting in numbers that are not appropriate. I mean, it's like the notion of negative payments, negative payables. So there's certain things then that you can build into XBRL. First of all, just in terms of what you have for data types, and the units can dictate syntax. And the data type can also limit that. In fact, it turns out that there's quite a few different data types, including the ability to say, I don't want to just have a number. I want to have a number that's 0 or positive, or has to be positive, or 0 or negative. And as a developer, you can pick the particular data types that basically force the data to be constrained into a particular mole or model. And that helps to avoid a lot of problems by just simply validating that particular information. And we also have a lot of other concept relation-based items that can help too. People are using terms that are outside of a particular presentation or entry point. You can consider that an error. Is it defined? Does it require calculations? And do you have those things? In addition, you can have business rules. Now, this XBRL formula, which has been around for a while, there's some new stuff being developed for formula. It's a little bit easier to understand. Formula is very comprehensive. And then there's Zool. And Zool does a lot more too with validation and allows you to write a lot of rules. In fact, the DQC rules are done with that. So we look at that basic business rules and then basic validation layer, and then you can add more things on there. And obviously it's good to have the prepare a software package, whatever that happens to be, to do as much work as possible with respect to that. And then who's ever consuming it can also do a quick validation and reject it if it doesn't meet certain standards. So then how do you actually turn around and build a taxonomy? And there's a process of going through that both in the management side, and there's a technical process of doing the work. Now, we happen to pick out using RL, and because RL is free, and it's accessible to everybody, and it'll get you going and whatnot. There's commercial packages out there that you can also consider using. I don't really know how many there are. I think there's at least 3 or 4 of them that are available. And this basically what we do is we walk you through, and we have some templates and examples so you can play around with this to actually build a taxonomy based on spreadsheet information or Google Sheets. RL will take an Excel sheet and bring in the data in various tabs and define your taxonomy for you. So we actually walk through that and then give you plenty of examples. Moving on getting towards the end of the document, we talk about documenting. This actually ends up being a critical thing. Obviously, you can't tell people how to use it if they say, well, what am I going to look at to be able to do this? And we show here, and we cover this in the documentation, kind of 4 different scenarios. I might be doing something that is a fairly small implementation with a fairly narrow audience, and I can just simply have a taxonomy guide. All I need is one document that talks about what this is and how a preparer should do it, and how some of the use cases are, creating a data model or a data consumer model. Or maybe I need to have something that's a guide, but then I want to do a data consumer guide that's completely separate because they don't care about any of this stuff here. They're just interested in how the data is structured. And then likewise, you might flip it around. And thirdly, you may end up with this situation where you have a taxonomy guide or one or more pieces, and some taxonomies have a lot of information associated with it. You have preparer guides, and then also you have use cases and consumer guides. So we provide that information as part of Chapter 8 on the kind of things that we feel would be part of that. And that's all based on past experience and things that have been published over the past 10 or 15 years to support taxonomies. And in fact, one of the things we do is at the end, we give you examples, and these are also available in Word. So if you're going to come up and say, I want to do a white paper, we're proposing this particular project. A good example would be the work in process of the surety project, where a white paper was published to say, how's this working today? Why do we want to try and bring this into a new format, into XBRL? And, so here's the problem, here's the solution, here are the things we looked at, and this is what we think would be a good solution. Similarly, we've got something for the actual taxonomy guide, the preparer's guide, and the data consumer guide, including some boilerplate XBRL language, so you don't have to sit there and write stuff. I think we've got about 3 pages or 4 pages of the basics of what XBRL is. So there's no point in having to spend time writing all this stuff. And then we have finally is the governance. How do you go through actually building this and maintaining it? What are your release cycles? How do you go through that process? Are you going to have a pilot? How are you going to implement it? In different ways, again, of approaching it. Now, if you're working this as a party in here, you may not be involved in every part of this, but at least here you get an idea of all the different things that need to be done. And then for whoever is actually chairing or running this particular thing, you can get an idea of what you're facing and what you need to do. We went through at the end here on chapter 10 and talked about some of the taxonomies that have been developed and implemented here in the United States. And actually, I think we may have one that is Australia in here. And the good and the bad. What were the learning pains that went along with it? What worked? What didn't work? And we discussed that, so everybody else can kind of get an idea of how that worked. I mean, we want you to walk away and look at this. Yeah, this is what we want to use, but we're not going to come around and say, well, it's perfect. It does everything. Don't worry about it. It'll all be done by tomorrow. This actually talks about, why things happen a particular way and, what made them a success. So that's our chapter 10. Now we provide a couple other things that are really important. This ended up being a little bit more work than anybody probably anticipated, but it's only about 15 pages, but we cover through basic stuff on what XML is and XBRL. We cover the data types registry, or the DTR, the unit types registry. And also we provide examples. We take our widget example and we provide it in inline XBRL, regular XML XBRL, and also in JSON. So those are available as samples, and you can play around with them. You've got the data, you can download the data, or you can copy and paste it. I would recommend downloading it. We also have a little checklist, which is kind of, hey, what do I need to do? May seem kind of stupid, but as you walk down that page, I think it's about a page, you can see the different things that we would view as checking off. Just mention the documentation. So here's all those pieces of the documentation that are provided. And finally, there's something that we do with the DSC. When I first took over chairing the DSC a number of years ago, the thing that we went after, and what I wanted to go after, was what is it that constitutes a good taxonomy? What is it that makes something complete? What are the ingredients to that? So what we did, rather than debating the rules and whatnot, is we created a set of approval metrics. And some of them might actually seem pretty stupid, like, well, do you have a preparer's guide? Does it cover these subjects? If you don't, is it in the consumer guide? There's a whole list of these things, and Appendix H lays that out. It's also available, we call it the TAM or TAM, on the XBRL US website as well. We haven't revised that subsequently. I think it's been out for about 3 years, and we've approved a couple taxonomies with it. It's a real good feedback tool because you get essentially a set of eyes that can run through that and give you back critique. Now, you don't have to do that. There's nothing that says that you have to come to XBRL US for any of this other than to download the document and use it. But we're here to help do that. And this is one of the tools, aside from documentation and things, that will do that. And part of that too, the second thing we did was you produced the style guide that have started and not finished, and that's basically talks about how to name your concepts. And I didn't talk about that anywhere in here, but we do talk about in the TDH. If you start thinking about it, if I've got, let's take GAP, like 17,000 concepts, how you name them starts becoming really important. So things can get very confusing if you don't follow certain rules. So we took the style guide and gave some guidance on how to name things. So kind of sum this up. I just mentioned that, it's open and it's freely available. We hope that you talk to us about it, because I think that we can add a lot of value to whatever you happen to be doing. And I think the organization has a lot to offer. It's non-proprietary. It's really the only standard that handles both financial data plus any number of other data types. It's widely used globally. It's innovative, supportive, and robust. There's a lot of stuff that's going on all over the world with it that's being used in a lot of different places. It's easy, less costly, and more accurate than doesn't rely on a single reporting model. So there's lots of benefits to using XBRL. And I think the TDH, I hope if you pick it up and say, I'm considering doing this, grab it, give it a read, spend an hour or two going through it, and you can learn about the process and learn about what it is and how it works. And then hopefully as you go on and make a decision to build something, you say, okay, this can be a guide. It can be that thing that somebody comes in and it's got all kinds of little bookmarks on. Well, that's on page 76, so where I've got the information on how to do my dimensions. Looking at what XBRL is, it's really, we're building on a stable standard. The original specification came out in 2003. You might look at it as XBRL 2.1 and go, wow, this is old. No, it's not. It's stable. The platform has actually answered the call to what it was supposed to be doing, and it hasn't really needed to have a significant revision. There's been a lot of things that have been added on. Some of them have to do with management. You look at the link role registry and registry specification and conformance testing, all things to do with improving or expanding how XBRL works. The data type registry, having a standard place to put different data types. I know as taxonomies have been developed here, I haven't been personally involved with them, but tangentially involved with FERC or WIP or things like that. A lot of extra data types have been added to the registry that can be used across the board. There's tons of them that are for energy. You could just imagine all the different ways you can represent things. Additional information on dimensions and etc. A big change came up, and I think it's now pretty much close to being done, is this idea of the open information model. And that's taking XBRL and saying, hey, we're not an XML based thing. We know there's a lot of other ways that we might want to represent the same data structure. A key thing about XBRL is it is allowing you to provide essentially a timeless data model with authoritative references and a lot of information to be able to give you the dimensionalization for particular facts or groups of facts. And what the open information model does, and it's not a very heavy read, it's a short document, talks about the different ways of representing that report data. And so that's how we end up then with XBRL for JSON and XBRL for CSV. I believe this is actually being used in a couple places now. And we've also added things in here like typed dimensions and extensible enumerations and things like that. This doesn't cover all the things that have happened in the US from other groups, like FASB's done an awful lot of work and published a lot of information with respect to XBRL. So I hope this gives people a good jumping off point with respect to what we're trying to accomplish. I think this is a major thing that we've done as an organization to get this information out there in a very readable and friendly manner, and hope you take advantage of it. And at this point, I think we'll move on and take some questions. And Michelle, I'll let you go ahead and manage that.
Great, Scott, thank you so much. That was really helpful. And we do have some questions. And this could be either for you or for Campbell. The question comes in from someone saying that someone who is a regulator saying, right now we're using XBRL files for instances. And he's interested in talking specifically about the transport model, I believe. So he says that means XML with all the schemas needed, not JSON, not XHTML, not CSV. What do you think about using different transportation methods for the same taxonomy reception? I guess there should not be any kind of anything inconvenient about the data field of relational database and to be extracted from it, but maybe there can be other kinds of, other kinds of problems. I guess it's like using different.
Yeah, I get the question, and I can answer that if you want.
Sure.
It obviously depends on your users, and obviously if you're rolling something out, you may want to say we're going to take XML, for example, or you could take it in JSON or inline XBRL. So obviously it's a user question what's going to be easier for them, but in theory it shouldn't make any difference what the underlying data, the underlying format is. Once you receive those files, you would turn them into your standard data model and load your database. And I can tell you what we do. So we do have a database where we're taking XBRL data, and then we're loading all that data into a relational database. And when we load that database, we load it through the software that Scott mentioned earlier, the REL software. And if it comes in as CSV, if it came in as JSON, if it came in as inline XBRL, and we have that today, we're receiving both inline XBRL and XML filings. We're really agnostic to the underlying data format that's used as long as it's an XBRL. And then we take either of those two formats and then we would put them into the database exactly the same way. We do actually capture some additional information. We actually do capture some of the inline, what was the original value captured in inline XBRL in our database. So that would be really the only thing you'd have to consider is there additional information that is specific to the data format that you wanted to capture. But the data model in a REL, for example, is the same so that you can load it either way.
Great, thank you. The next question I think really pertains to US GAAP reporting. And the question is, for something like sales or revenue top line, there are 1,529 distinct tags, and I believe he's referring to the US GAAP taxonomy. Is there a numerical system so that we can standardize or group the tags? While the detailed and descriptive tags are helpful when looking at individual companies, we need ways to standardize the tags so that we can compare data among different companies. So this is speaking to like using the data. So either one of you, if you feel comfortable responding to that one.
I think, Campbell, you're probably better at addressing that. So I'll just add on to that. One of the things that was worked on a couple of years ago was use cases and use case models, because this is a big modeling problem. So and with that, I'll let Campbell finish it.
Yeah, so there were recent changes made to the taxonomy for this and maybe this is just specific to revenue, with there were changes in the accounting standards relating to revenue recognition. So there'd been a move within, FASB basically did an overhaul of this whole area for kind of the reason that you mentioned. You had all these distinct line items for every different possible type of revenue. So they basically dimensionalized this. And so you've got so now you have a revenue tag, which really represents revenue from a particular type of revenue, which is what the FASB calls 606 revenue, which is really saying, hey, we're going to recognize this revenue this way because it's a contractual relationship we have with someone we're selling the product to. And what they did was there's just one tag for that revenue. So in theory, as time goes on, as everyone's adopted 606, there should be one revenue tag. There's actually a couple. There's one including excise tax or sales tax, one excluding sales tax. And the FASB actually had another one for revenue, which is not 606 revenue. So they basically boiled it down to these three tags. But then to disaggregate the revenues, they added you have to break it down by product or service. So if you want to do the analysis of this, really what you need to do is you need to go and look at for the revenue, for those revenue tags, and then look at, if they've disaggregated along a particular product or service.
Great. Okay.
I think one thing that got kind of lost in the process over the past decade is each company, if you take SEC with GAAP, is supposed to file under a particular namespace, and that namespace ideally shouldn't change until your model changes a little bit. So that way, if you're a consumer, I can build my specific models and have whatever exceptions I needed to have for the particular registrant. And then as that namespace then changes, that would be a good cue to say, okay, now I need to maybe look at my model and just verify things are okay. But what's happened is a lot of times to every quarter, they use a different namespace. So.
Okay, I think we have a couple of other questions.
Excuse me.
How does the TDH differ from the technical XBRL specification? Shouldn't we just read the technical spec?
I guess if you're, a total nerd at heart, you can open up the 2.1 spec and read through it. I've gone through it. I've used it as a reference, but it doesn't really tell you how and why. It's more about how to format, more about how to represent things that, you shall and you must. In fact, it uses a thing called RFC 2119, which everybody's probably seen, but doesn't really know what it is. It talks about what shall, may, must, and what that actually means. We don't really do that in TDH. We're not a specification. We're saying, distilling this down into kind of a human readable point, this is what you need to do. And then here, go look at this if you want to know why, or the details on how to particularly do it. Similarly with dimensions, if you go read the dimensions document, it's highly technical. And you may have to, as a software developer, dig into those things. But as someone who is an SME on a particular subject that has to do with data, but has nothing to do with XBRL, you don't care about that stuff. You want to know about the high level side. And that's what the TDH provides.
Great, thank you. And just one last question, Scott, because I think we're coming to the end of the hour here. Is the Taxonomy Development Handbook a hard and fast document, or do you expect this to change or evolve?
We expect that there'll be a second edition, looking at things that we think that might be shortcomings that could be amplified. We're waiting for more feedback. We got a lot of feedback from a couple organizations that we applied here. And of course, members who participated in this provided feedback as well. We may find that there are things in here that people don't find particularly useful, or we may find things that they'd like to see a lot more data on. When we first started this, we kind of had this vision of, hey, let's have an example and run it all through. But it turned out that a lot of that started to be really complicated to implement. So I'd like to see how it fleshes out, but yeah, we do plan on doing a second edition of it at some point in the future. It could be a year, it could be 3 years. I'm not sure. We'll see how that works out.
Great, thank you. One last thing I think we wanted to cover, and those are all the questions we have right now. I just want to mention again, as I mentioned earlier, that we are having a Regulator workshop webinar series. The first one is going to be held on September 16th. And it's going to be focusing on the taxonomy as a single data model. Will be held at 3 o'clock, and we have a number of different speakers who are going to be engaged in those. And then future sessions that we'll have are, on how XBRL represents data, how it establishes data relationships, how to get started, and how to build a taxonomy. So essentially, we'll be taking a lot of the content that Scott walked through today at a very high level and doing a deep dive into each of those sessions. So we hope that you'll all join us and tell other people you know. And these are all free events just designed to help regulators know how they can work with XBRL to build good quality standards programs. So thank you very much. Please read the TDH, and hope to see you back here again at our next webinar in September. Thank you.